Today we have a fascinating discussion in store for you. I am your host, David Gornoski. We're listening to a lot of crazy stories out there, but luckily we have a good neighbor who's going to join us today. He's the host of the Rooster's Crow podcast, and he's here for a Things Hidden discussion. James Kourtides, how you doing, sir?
Hey, I'm well, David. Thanks for being with me again, and we're actual neighbors as well. So
Yeah.
I love having someone like you so close by. It's rare to have someone physically so close to you that shares these ideas. So good to be with you again for sure.
You know, you look at all of these different headlines going around of craziness, of discord, and I think we're just going to have a conversation about the failure of the left versus right dialectic. It's very trendy to talk about how dialectic is a problem, but very few people seem to actually understand how to identify what it looks like and how to step out of it without being pulled into the circuits that doesn't give us anything we want. So, you know, one of the things that I think, and we were just talking before we started this about, which is how the right continually always, like Tom and Jerry, falls for the tricks of the left. That Jerry is smaller in terms of he looks like the victim because he's the mouse, but he's always the one that has the upper hand. He's always winning, used most of the time. Tom is the cat. He looks like the predator. He looks bigger. He looks like he should be able to take it on, but he always loses in that dynamic Tom and Jerry have. And I think that's how the left and right kind of play it out. The left always sets a trap for the right, and the right always takes the bait. And you see this time and time again. They learn nothing. There's good critiques to make about libertarianism. There's good critiques that some of the conservatives make. There's good critiques that conservatives have made about Bushism and Reaganism. There's good critiques that they've made at these different, iterations, but they still every new iteration they come up with, it always falls in the same problem, which is it doesn't understand the power of the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It just doesn't have a clue what that looks like. And maybe we can talk about that today.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that's highly relevant here. It's obvious that the left thinks strategically and operationally, and the right just generally wants to be left alone. So they get caught in these traps of problem reaction solution, and they fall for it every time. Like we were talking before, the Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light endorsement, right? And then we saw the reaction by Kid Rock where he took a bunch of 12 packs and took his gun towards it, right? That is not a bug. That is not an ancillary thing. That is the reason, right? These reactions are what counts. These are the reactions why the left does these crazy things, right? And we fall, and the right falls for it at hook, line, and sinker every time. And it's quite a thing to see and behold as it happens, because you can feel yourself or myself get pulled into it when you see something you want to react a certain way. But the best thing to do is not react, observe, right? And observe what their tactics are and how they keep using the same tactics. We see it all the time, right? They give you, they don't surround you on all sides, right? They leave you one opening, and that one opening is your retreat. Like we were talking before, like school choice to get away from this indoctrination, right? But then the accreditation agencies and associations, they're all have been captured, right? All the institutions have been captured. So there's really never a win. There's just like a retreat that the left ratchet continues to gain a stronghold, right? Like the idea of a national divorce or the balkanization of the United States. That is what the cultural revolution wants. So when it has the right saying, "Oh, we need a national divorce, we need a break things up," that's the point of a cultural revolution. That's the point of the tactics of demoralization, is to have that, and that's coming from those that are supposed to be conservative, those that are supposed to have an answer or solution. They're playing right into the trap, and they continue to do it. And we were talking a little about before, and I think it was James Lindsay who has this idea, is that they're looking for a trans George Floyd, right? They're looking for, that's why they're continuing to egg on this trans movement and whatnot, so they can find their martyr, so they can sacrifice one of their own and see, look, I told you they're all racist, bigots, and homophobes. Look what happened. They killed this poor trans person. That's probably what's they're angling for here. So got to get in front of it.
everything we see in culture is all within the sandbox that Jesus inaugurated 2,000 years ago. Everything. And yet, and you see now that people it's trendy to want to become a trad this or that or whatever. That's become a trend. But I look at that and I still don't see folks even beginning to grasp what it means that 2,000 years ago Jesus destroyed myth making and destroyed the structural violence of sacred violence, containing our violence, containing our desires within a hierarchy mediated by forms of sacrifice. They don't understand that when you've had that 2,000 years of subversion of that, people want to take Christianity, always, the conservatives do, and say it's just a stand-in for conservative traditionalism. But that's just paganism. I'm sorry. That's just paganism. Paganism has virtue. Paganism has containment of desires. Paganism has hierarchy. Paganism has meritocracy in some sense. There's aristocracy and so forth in it, but there's some level of virtue and excellence promoted within paganism, even though it's, there's a lot of aristocracy embedded in it. But paganism has all those different. Paganism has differentiation sometimes. Actually, most of the time, because the only time in which differentiation is allowed to loosen is in the kairos, in the time of a sacred time before sacrifice, right? Where you have festival, where everybody loses their identity. And the right just does not understand. So when they have a Floyd and you have them come out and attack the man's past record, they don't understand that doesn't mean anything. Facts don't mean anything when you're dealing with mythic narratives, when you're dealing with narratives that visually represent the next iteration of martyrdom within the messianic movement of the statist ideology that animates the left. They don't understand it. It's like, I've told people this before, it's like taking a butter knife up against a tribe of cannibals and saying, that's what your reason is like. It's so impotent. Taking your little butter knives, I got you now. I've got my reason. Don't you know their fact sheet? Don't you know the rap sheet of George Floyd? I gotcha. It's like, you have no idea the level of passion and desire that is built into culture, because culture is religion, right? It is religion. And everything that animates the American left and the Western left is a mutated, vicious, angry, aggressive, totalitarian mutation of Christianity. And it's hungry. And it doesn't want grace. It doesn't want mercy. It wants revenge. It's revenge of the nerds Christianity. And trying to come out and say, well, you see the right come out with these trailers of the 1980s movies and they say, I want to go back. And it's like, duh, if you want to go back, why don't you watch the movies for one moment? The movies of these 80s movies, they always point to Gillette commercials of the masculine men. But really what animated that period of time was still the underdog. And they still don't understand that is the zeitgeist of everything in society, is the position of the perceived victim, of the perceived underdog or ally, right? That word ally, of the underdog, of the scapegoat.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. And I think when we look at the Christian story and we look at the biblical narrative, after the death and resurrection of Christ, it's not all puppy dogs and ice cream. It actually culminates in the book of Revelation, right? And I think Girard was prescient in identifying these patterns of victimization and the scapegoating mechanism run amok when his kind of take on what the near to medium term future holds. It wasn't a resolution of all these, all of these categories, or a resolution of all of these contraindications. It's actually a culmination in a kind of crescendo into a threshold, and we're seeing it ramp up, and it's through this technological pressure that's this hyper digitization that we're seeing is the result of that, right? So we've seen what we've been through in the last 2-3 years with COVID and the reaction there, and it's scrambled people's brains, good, well-meaning people, liberal people have lost the ability to make sense of the world. And now we just drop Chat GPT-4 into the mix, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's worried about the alignment problem. Like, what if the AI is malevolent? That's one issue. What if the AI is not malevolent, but it's just so hyper rational and logical that it turns everybody into paperclips? Right. The third thing out there is that what happens when, and I think we've already seen that, right? When an AI understands how to move the social forces, the social and political forces, as it's programmed biasly by its programmers, consciously or unconsciously, and it starts scrambling things even more, and we're going to see things ramp up and increase in their intensity. And if we can't keep looking to see on Twitter to see if there's some kind of reorientation, right? You say that the revolution won't be televised, the counter revolution won't be digitized. It's not going to be on our digital screens. And my solace is when I'm on Twitter, when I'm on social media, it's like, oh man, we're moving into World War III. We're coming off the petrodollar, and Russia is aligning with China and Brazil, and all of these steps, which are things that are happening, right? But if you turn the screens off, right, and you look around your community, your local community, at least when I do, that's all a simulation. It's a simulacrum of actual reality where I'm taking care of your kids, coaching football, taking care of people that you work with, and taking care of your community, right? So I got to keep focusing on the real reality around us, because something that's occurred to me that we've seen on Twitter and on social media, it's a simulated thinking. It's a simulacra of thinking, right? So it's this appearance that there's some cognition or that there's some processing happening, but it's not. It's this superficial surface, algorithm that's playing itself out, mostly on digital media, right? So, but the solution is not going to come from, a Laura Loomer or a Charlie Kirk or things of that nature. The solution is going to come from people that aren't, that have been canceled and they're kind of gone. We were talking about before, and I don't mean specific this example, like an Owen Benjamin or Kanye West. Hey, look what they're doing, right? It's not going to be someone that finally owns the libtards on Twitter that's going to, change things or reorient things in the appropriate direction. That's just not going to be the case.
Exactly. One of the things that I try to emphasize on our programs is how we talk so much about fake news and stuff, but there's a lot of fake things that we assume are real that need to go ahead and be pushed over because they're fake. And that includes things like outdated physics, right? And I think that when you start there and you start pacing, that's how if you want to lead, you have to pace. So you go out and take a position that everybody out there in the world is saying, what are you talking about physics for? Don't you see what they did to Bud Light? Who gives a rat's tail about these cultural things when you actually understand the stakes at play when you talk about something like physics? And when you start playing in the world of atoms, when you start playing in incarnational truth, that's what I look at. I look at what is actually the driving impetus for our society. And I think it is going to take place in the world of material, the world of atoms, the world of where human culture can advance in a way that actually makes change possible. I don't think that is just getting another political scandal or another culture war win. Those things are all rear view mirror approaches to things. It's like fighting for Dr. Seuss, fighting for do you even remember this stuff? The stuff is just coming. It just comes and goes. It's so superfluous. It's so superfluous. And yet you look at, what is it that we're supposed to do if we are to be imitators of Jesus? Jesus dealt with people by healing their material lacks. They had eyesight issues. He healed their eyes. They had an issue with fishing. He gave them more fish than they could possibly imagine. He was dealing with people at that level. And whenever I mention this, a lot of conservatives have been programmed by the dialectic to say, oh, you're one of those techno, what's the techno utopians or something like that. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is actual real material movement. For example, the Revolutionary War, I bring this up. The Revolutionary War would not have been possible if it wasn't for the musket, right? The musket allowed the logic of violence to change in its paradigm. And it went from, one in which war was a aristocratic game where you line up and you have to be in the, you think about the medieval times, the knights, these were these rich trust fund kids that had all these expensive swords and armory and everything and all these advanced things. And then you had the peasants. They just had pitchforks and they had to take care of the land for the trust fund boys. They'll run out and go get some gold somewhere. But things change. The logic of state violence changed for good and bad. When the Revolutionary War, you have muskets, and now the farmer can hide behind a tree and pick off a few redcoats. And now the symmetry of power is shifted. It's become more symmetrical than it was asymmetrical in the past. And the same thing is going to happen if people who are whining and complaining about Bud Light, this garbage product nobody wants to drink, never did. If they, what would you spend your time doing if you actually wanted to be productive? You'd be advancing material advancement so that the logic of the relationship between sovereign and individual would change to make it more symmetrical. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think, and the question of the sovereign and the individuals is related to the question of freedom and obedience, right? And I think Christ gave us the answer in the story of the Samaritan woman when he said, don't lock eyes with the mob. If you lock eyes with the mob, you're pulled into this mob mentality. So you don't lock eyes with the mob, right? And you explore material and parallel solutions like you're talking about. We're looking at different theories in physics and whatnot. So it's not going to be revealed to us on MSNBC, NBC, or on Twitter, these physical revolutions that are happening, in the way that we interact with our food and process our food and the way that we react with material reality. It's going to happen on the fringes, right? It's when every institution, every corporation is captured completely, right? It's not going to let those innovators come into the fold in any kind of meaningful way. There's way too much money involved. There's way too many interests involved. So it's going to happen on the fringes, but the social machine is going to continue to look at the fringes in a conspiratorial way and minimize anybody that's exploring these territories and these avenues. So I would encourage you and others to continue to explore these attitudes and these different situations that are happening in physical reality with physics, like you do with Dr. Yu and whatnot. We got to keep going with that. We can't get demoralized or discouraged because it's not being picked up by the mainstream. It's never going to be picked up in the mainstream. That's not a bug. That's a feature of the system, in a sense. And John Bolger wrote a book called "The Iraq War Didn't Happen," right? Like you're saying, the musket made the Revolutionary War possible. Like the Twitter made the war in Ukraine possible. Like, it's more of a digital psychological campaign than it is a physical war, right? You know how many Ukrainian civilians have died from a number that I've heard recently? Less than 10,000, right? We have 100,000 Americans that die every year from fentanyl and drug overdose. But how much of our time and resources is spent on addressing that problem, which is not an easy solution, but it's possible if we focus on it collectively. But it's not going to happen collectively, so it's going to have to be you kind of fought on the local level. We spend enough time and resources on these issues, then they will be fixed and things will turn. But it's never going to happen from the mainstream. It's never going to happen from the social collective that we see. So it's going to happen from local people, local communities addressing the people that are closest to them, and it kind of branches out from there. So every time I look at it from a global perspective or a digital media perspective, it seems hopeless. Every time again I look around and see the persons around me, I'm encouraged.
Let's go back to the cultural thing. Let's explain to the audience a little bit the process by which the left tricks the right into playing the same stupid role every time. What typically happens is that you have a scandalous vice that's provocatively embraced by the hegemonic left. They embrace a new kind of vice or some kind of scandalous act of, perhaps you could call it, again, something that is not acceptable normative behavior, right? That is the foundation by which they drive this kind of interesting dynamic by which all of a sudden the person who feels differentiated, that means outside of the sea of sameness of the rest of the culture, they can be identified as the carrier of the pollution of that community, of the carrier of the irresistible differentiation from the rest of the community. And what happens is when the right takes the bait and says, yes, you are X, the sin that they have taken on as a badge, they give it power. It's so important to understand this. I know this is a little bit convoluted, but it's going to all come back into a very simple explanation. I'm just trying to figure out how to explain this because this is kind of like the mechanics of what's happening. It's easy to just say, yeah, scapegoat, but to actually get into the sausage making of how this actually happens each time. When you identify someone with their sin, what happens is you're not actually giving them a Christian rebuke, right? This is important, I think, because when someone says, I'm doing X behavior, and then you say, you are an X behavior, what are you doing? You're creating power with that exclusion identity marker, right? You're saying X behavior is now a marker of being a sacred outcast. So, for example, they want to normalize at some point, they'll normalize bestiality. I know they're trying it in some. And so when they continue to do little things to try to move that ball forward, when the right comes in there and says, you are a bestiality person, and that's dirty, you dirty bestiality person. What you're doing is you're giving, in some way, it's a weird way, but this is kind of a spiritual, anthropological, you can look at it different layers. But when you elevate the transgression as the identity of the person, rather than their identity being made in the image of God, right? What you're doing is you're almost giving that sin power to take on a victim currency. You see? And so therefore they have oxygen to feed off of that and to say, yeah, let's go further with that. Look at me. I'm being persecuted because I'm a beast. That's what they're saying. You know, the bestiality stuff, they're making me I'm a martyr. Love is love, you know? And so what happens is you have to learn to not identify the person with the transgression that they're playing with to get your attention. When you identify the person with the transgression, you give it power to take and consume that person to a victim identity. And that's really what's going on with like everything in this left versus right discourse, is that if you would learn to say, we're not going to normalize the transgression, but we're not going to scandalize you and define you by the transgression that you ask us to define you by. So important. So important, because the Bible's all about naming things. Don't name the person based on their sin. When you name it, when you give them a kind of victim power, that people in the middle will say, my gosh, why are you excluding them because of that? Where I once thought it was ugly, your exclusion of them by identifying them as that now starts to lose its legitimacy of in versus out. Does that make sense? Because this is what it means when we talk about God dying on the outside of our insider club. He wasn't killed inside the city. He wasn't killed in town square. He was not lynched at the steps of the temple. He was lynched outside, right? And so the pattern of all cultural discourse is going to flow archetypally through that same outside motion. I know this is strange. Maybe Christians don't typically think of it this way, but I think you understand where I'm getting at, right?
Yeah, ironically, the Christian trope of love the sinner, hate the sin, right, is operative here, right?
Yeah.
The irony that if you actually, from a Christian heart perspective, love the person that's sinning, that short circuits this victimhood mentality,
Yeah.
right? They make it almost impossible to do that, because like we were talking before, like when the left or even the right, when identity coalesces around something that is a sin, right? Let's say like the LGBTQ plus community, right? They're identifying with their sin. And I'm not saying that, gay people are sinners and straight people aren't sinners, right? Like sodomy is a sin in its sense that it misses the mark in terms of a collective organized society to drive the population forward in a healthy way, right? It doesn't efface it. It's going to be there, right? But once you build an identity around it, then try to critique it, you're always going to be called a homophobe, a bigot, X, Y, and Z. And that's the system. And you're right. That's participating in the dialectic.
But they don't build it overnight. That's
no,
important.
they do it. They do it over
time. They build
it
based on every brick of the traditionalists labeling them by their sin that they desire to be labeled by. You see, it's a process, brick by brick. It's so important because we always look at it in the rear view and say, look how hard it is. But they didn't do that overnight. They didn't do it overnight. It takes a lot of people falling into the religious reactionary mode of disgust reflex to say, scapegoat, you are a blank adulterer. You are a liar, right? And you put that accusation label. Once the accusation label is taken in, it takes time, but that slowly, brick by brick, collectively becomes this victim shield of power. For example, look at the pot community, right? The pot community does the same thing. It's a similar kind of a feature because I've always been anti-drug war. I think anybody who's a Christian would be anti-drug war if they actually understood how things work, supply and demand. But it's interesting that, the same system is kind of at work here with this, right? Because of the brutality of the drug war, it is harder for a community, it's harder for a society to reckon with the ugliness of what they've been doing to victims of the drug war by looking at the individual human suffering that and family suffering that takes place when you lock people up for decades or kill someone in a drug raid and stuff like that. It's hard to like fathom that. So an emotional shortcut way, a kind of emotional postcard way of dealing with this is to just basically romanticize the object of desire that has been prohibited so that you create pot culture, stoner culture, right? It's easier to create stoner culture as the impetus for this legalization movement than just repenting of the violence being done to people for a nonviolent vice. Does that make sense? It's like, and so that's how the kind of dialectic feeds itself. And my answer is, if Christians had been forefront using their Christian understanding of protection of victims from violence, you could have surgically gone in and humanized the victims of the drug war without reactionary creating a stoner culture as a, victim and shielded kind of currency and culture. Because once you do that, you're going from one sin to the other. There's a sin to put someone in a cage for nonviolent act, but it's also a sin to fetishize and idolize something that can become a symbol for not reaching your true potential. So both of those are, again, that's perfectly a dialectic move. We go from throwing people away, and we're still throwing people away while we're in the process of building up a victim-encased culture of, look how cute it is to be a rebel. Look how cute it is to play video games and do nothing with your life. And so rather than falling into that, we could have done the surgical move, which is protect the victim and don't love the sin or the culture that can build up in a sinful way around fetishizing some new taboo behavior. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it gets to the very heart of evil from a biblical perspective, right? The term Satan, Satanas, literally means the accuser. So if you ever find your space, your place, your orientation in an accusatory manner, you're under the spirit of demonic influence, 100%, right? So how do you short circuit that? The question I think is, how do you address this at a collective level? Is it possible to address it? Because you can yourself love the sinner and hate the sin, right? You and I think that's where it starts. You have to yourself not react in these certain ways, not become the accuser yourself, no matter how egregious the act is. You don't retreat, but you don't just play into the dialectic. You separate yourself from it. But how do we do that collectively? Is it possible to do that collectively? If we saw something like Kanye West and Kim Kardashian, of all people, that had a specific person in mind that was being held in prison, and got that specific person out by telling us their name, their story, and their background. Right? You did it years ago with someone, I think, in the state of Florida that had a drug charge as well. Right? That's the tough slog of doing the work, is doing that. But it seems fruitless or hopeless when you do it with one person and you're seeing it just stacking up at a fractal level. Question is it possible? What would it look like to do this collectively?
Right. Well, there's different ways. I mean, you're talking like from a political standpoint, there's one way, but I mean, just culturally, it would take, so you have some in the conservative movement who are generally pro criminal justice reform. Then you have, that's considered now, which is so weird. That's become now like the establishment aligned position. The populist, which is interesting because it used to be the anti-establishment line when it was neocon versus libertarian dissident, right? And then it went neocon kind of melding with neocon light to create this kind of Reaganism mixed with neocon as the establishment. And then libertarianism got kind of pushed down, or some of it got integrated into the establishment, depending on how you looked at it. And then populism and nationalism became the new dissident right. And so the populist reaction to neocons mouthing the rhetoric of criminal justice reform is that they've taken the opposite position of beat them up, get rid of them, hit their heads on the wall when you put them into the police car, like the former president said, hit their heads on the police car, door when they're going in the roof or whatever. So, that kind of rhetoric just sets you up for the obvious heel role again, the villain role, where you're the Romans persecuting someone unjustly, treating them ugly, and that creates the dynamic where when their people get locked up, there's a kind of, well, I guess they deserve it because they live by the sword, they die by the sword. And that's the problem with the muscular rhetoric of the right. It's paper thin because they just keep getting arrested over and over again. And they look like Tiny Tim or something where they're saying, I'll get you back one day. You just wait till I'm Caesar. It's like, dude, nobody cares. Like you're getting locked up left and right. You either embrace the role of the nonviolent resistance, nonviolent movement that you could embrace in a Christological way and imitating Jesus, or you keep talking a big game like, I'll get you one day when I'm Caesar. And in the moderate middle, the normies are just going to say, let's just keep locking up little wannabe Caesars because that's fun. That's how people look. Because the right this new right talks a big game about power. You got to understand power. Have you read James Burnham? They love talking like that, but they don't really understand what they're talking about, in my opinion, because they don't have the anthropology of Christianity to season and to contextualize their romanticization of power. They still live as if the world is a static world. But you know what a static world is? A pagan world where the cross never happened. A static world is where history is not going anywhere. But they don't like that. I'm telling you, they hate what I'm talking about. If they even understand, a lot of them understand it, because what I'm saying completely negates so much of their project from the very root. It totally flips everything on its head. They're right to critique libertarianism for appealing to reason and rationality. That's a good critique of libertarianism. And I'm not promoting libertarianism. I'm promoting what it means to actually understand how to use the social aikido of Jesus to disarm the powers in a non-resistance way. I mean, it's not going to be easy. It's not an easy autopilot thing. You will have to probably be in danger of being crucified. But you'll be crucified doing the little Caesar way too, but you won't get any of the actual victim power that comes with following Christ, right? Jesus says, my power is made perfect in weakness. He doesn't say, my power is made perfect in you trying to be a little Caesar. 2,000 years later, they still don't get it. They still want to be little Caesars. They want that little, I'm going to get you back. And I'm going to get you back is not a selling point. When you're trying to argue a different position in the market, just from a business standpoint, you have the one that's using dictatorial power. Then you have the team that says, well, we want to use that too one day. It's not fair. The people in the middle are going to choose, I'll just take the dictator style I know. They make the movies I'm familiar with. They make the advertising campaigns I'm familiar with. I don't like it, but it's what we've had for generations. And I'll stick with that.
Yeah, it's the humility part of the Christian stories is the toughest part, right? And this crucifying the intellect and crucifying the flesh, right? And in doing so, though, it gives you the real power of not to reverse the oppression, right? The idea is to end oppression, not to reverse oppression. And I think what we've seen happen kind of remarkably is the neocon of the Bush, Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz foreign policy era, right, has taken and morphed into the left, cultural space now. Because the neocon said, oh, like the left has the culture, you need the culture, politics is downstream by culture. And they took the skin of the left, right, and just put it on. They're literally wearing the skin. The neocons are wearing the skin of the left, and they're and that's why it seems everything is reversed and flipped right now, right? So it's gonna take, that's why this is the reason I think Jordan Peterson resonated a lot, because he's talking about clean your room. He's talking about take responsibility, take accountability, but that's going to have to be fractally done and scaled at a high level. And I think it is happening, but again, it's not going to be televised. It's not going to be digitized. It's not going to be on social media. Everything on social media almost entirely will be the antithesis of what we're talking about here. Right?
Go ahead.
So how do you keep the compass, right, to follow and imitate Christ when at every turn from all of the social channels that are fed into us where the opposite is happening? How do you do that?
Someone just has to start doing it. No one's doing it. So it just has to be tried. Like, for example, the word faith means trust, right? We talked about this in recent episodes of Things Hidden, trust, the trustworthiness, right? So if we're going to exhibit trust in what Jesus has shown us in history, that means we're going to have, if we truly trust him, and no, it's not always going to be perfect every day, but if we truly trust that what he did is a sign of God's disposition towards humanity, then we will not fear death. And when we don't fear death, that's the most confident person in the room you want to be around. And when we talk about what do humans actually find attractive, they find confidence the most attractive thing to follow when it terms of who should I follow, who should I imitate. Now, what does it mean to not fear death? You hear this a lot with, again, the fake little Twitterverse world, which I'm not, I don't really spend too much time on Twitter. Probably too much time already, even though it's not to be on there all the time. But, you'll see a lot of this, well, you have to embrace the way of the cross means to fight for your enemies, even if they kill you. No, that's not a Christian martyr. Okay? It's not a Christian martyr. Christian martyr does not, in my opinion, or from what I understand the tradition, Christian martyr is not someone who dies on a battlefield trying to, take an enemy town. Christian martyr is someone who lays down his life for even his enemies. The Christian martyr is someone who doesn't say, well, because they have a pagan martyr's mindset. I will go out fighting and battling and trying to arrest their people, and if I get arrested in the process, then I'm a martyr for the cause. No, that's not a Christian martyr. You just martyred yourself blaspheming Jesus, really, even if you think you're a Christian. What really means to imitate Jesus is to lay down your life in non-violence, non-aggression, non-vengeance. That's how you sell the world. Sell the world. The word sell doesn't do justice, but that's how you show the world that death has been defeated. Is that the biggest thing that people fear? That's what won over the Roman Empire. Is that they could torture you and strip your skin off piece by piece. And they had martyrs running towards their martyr's death saying, go ahead and do it to me. I can't wait to meet God. And they said, good Lord, the worst torture, terror we could employ makes these people run towards it. The pagan world had never seen confidence so strong before. No God had ever created people that strong. Most all human beings up until that point in history were whining and crying in their torture and said, "Dear God, I don't deserve it, you evil people. I'll get you back when my little Caesar movement comes to power. You just wait." That's not what they saw. They saw people who fearlessly disregarded the shadow of death because they truly believed in the historical reality of the resurrection. And if you truly grasp the explosive sign that is the resurrection, that it's the one dying and rising God story in history that creates division, just as Jesus said, "I've come to bring a sword to cut through the false sense of transcendence and peace that the world had always known." And therefore, that's the sign. The sign is that the unity, the peace that the world had known would no longer remain in place wherever the story of his resurrection would go. That now you would have to take account for the people who were the fodder for your sacrificial machine. Even those who are oppressors, you would have to be loving them as well. And that's something that Jesus' contemporaries could not stomach. They murdered him, and then they set in motion their own system's demise, and all systems predicated on the same exclusion of someone who defies their unanimous consent, their unanimous story. And so that's what we have to understand, that that's what we're dealing with when we want to follow Jesus. And therefore, the way we follow him will look very alien to political logic. And it'll look very alien to playing it safe on a strategic level. It'll look audacious. It'll look insanely crazy, wild, subversive. And that's why nobody wants to try it, because nobody wants to be excluded and have nobody wants to get excluded and have no recourse of defense. And they're afraid of that. People are afraid of being socially isolated.
I hate to come back to Kanye, right? People call him crazy, and he say he's crazy because he gave up all of his endorsements, his deal with Reebok or Adidas, right? They dropped him in front of everybody. He gave up everything in a sense, right? It's the concept of no weapon against me shall prosper, right? That doesn't mean I turn the weapon against the other and start accusing and destroy them, right? No weapon against me shall prosper. And one of the people that affected me the most, and I've had a couple conversations personally with him, is Father Turbo Qualls. And he said something to me, and this is why I'm an Orthodox Christian. I mean, one of the large parts, and he said to me, Orthodox Christianity teaches you not to flinch, teaches you not to flinch. And in that space of not flinching, you become a leader and people will follow you. And this can happen as a mundane environment, as a football game, when you have a quarterback or a team that's all odds against them, right? They don't flinch in the face of danger, in the face of, and they persevere and they overcome, right? They don't do that by reversing oppression in a sense. And I think a beautiful example of this, and again, Father Turbo Qualls was part of the group of St. Moses the Black. St. Moses the Black is a Ethiopian Orthodox saint. And he, in the, I think, 5th, 6th century, I don't remember exactly when it was, he was a rapist, a murderer, a philanderer. He would go around with gangs of thugs and go and terrorize people. And he became a saint of the Orthodox Church. An African-American, so to speak, an Ethiopian St. Moses the Black, was brought into the fold of and became an Orthodox saint. How did he become that? He was part of the story is when he came into the place of worship with the elders, and the elders, accused him. What is he doing? He shouldn't be here. Started this process of accusation. And what did St. Moses the Black do? He said nothing. He said nothing. And then when he did that, he was accepted into the fold and became an Orthodox saint of the Orthodox Church, right? And they asked him, when everybody was accusing you, everybody was calling you this, that, and the other, didn't it grieve you? He said, it did grieve me, but I said nothing. And in that denial of his self, of his life, of his reputation, in that denial, he found his sainthood, right? So it's going to take examples of, if we want to talk about it from a cultural perspective and from a social perspective, it's going to take something like a Kanye West, doing these things in front of everybody, being called X, Y, and Z, being deleted from the internet, being dropped from all of his, all of endorsement deals, and losing billions of dollars, and losing his family, and losing his wife and his kids. It's going to take someone like Mark Wahlberg, right, who is now all coming out and saying he's participating in Lent. It's going to take these type of events in the social milieu for it to catch on, from a social and more collective perspective. But from a personal perspective, it's going to come from each of us doing it, with our relationship with Christ and laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters around us. That's what it's going to take. And you don't have to worry about the rest of it, because you have trust and you have faith in Christ, and you have faith in the Christian story by participating in it with persons, right? The whole Gnostic cult that's being unleashed on us is anti-personal, it's anti-incarnational. So the solution to that is not to demean it, to call it X, Y, and Z, and to reverse the situation. It's to become incarnational. It's to become personal. It's to become a person that interacts with people at the physical, material, personal level. And in doing so, no matter how small the interaction is, someone at the corner store, you treat them as a person. You interact with them as a person. That's contagious. It's infectious, and that's what will change things. And it's like the mustard seed, right? The Christian story, Christ is like leaven, right? A little bit of leaven that permeates through the culture, right? And it happens subtly, and it happens through individuals, and then through families, and through collectives, and eventually, you will see the kingdom kind of manifest out of these personal interactions that we're seeing. So I always see I have these two forms in my mind: the personal, incarnational, and then the collective, social. Because I have kids, and as much faith and trust I have, I'm worried about my kids, and what is their interaction going to be like? How are they going to deal with the world as it's increasingly coming and disincarnated and more Gnostic and digital, with AI in the mix, right? You have to come back to that faith and that trust in Christ, and continue the work of imitating his life.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. I still am skeptical about the AI thing. I think that those are pretty. I don't think they're ever going to get anywhere close to the power of incarnational um, human beings and their capacity and their soul and mind and everything.
But they will imitate it. They will look. They will. It doesn't matter if they do or not. Of course, they won't, right? But the appearance and the perception will be enough. Right. And when we talk about the Antichrist, we talk about, instead of Christ, we talk about a Christ-like figure that solves all the world's problems. Right. That's what we're seeing, I think, here in this phenomenon that we're seeing. Of course, it's not going to be incarnational, but it's going to appear to be incarnational. And that appearance of consciousness is going to be enough for most people, where we're going to see AI rights. We're going to see the same thing that we're seeing with, these different affordances of rights on these different populations. We're going to see that in the AI space as well, I would say.
Where you're going to be fined if you disagree with what AI says, or something, for a microaggression.
Yeah. Exactly. And we laugh, but there are already spaces in Canada. We just hear where if you're in a particular space in 100 feet or whatever around a trans person or a community, you can't even talk negatively about this collective, this community. That just came out last week, but we're seeing that, and it's going to continue. So it's going to continue to look, it's going to amplify, and the technology is going to amplify.
But look how the law is all just meant to, at least what you just described, you shouldn't speak ill of anybody if you want to be a saint anyway. So, I don't know. I don't know what the parameters of what is speaking ill is, but they're always trying to catch you in a reactionary sin,
You can't avoid speaking ill about someone or
I guess group. If you misgender them or mispronoun them on accident, that would be speaking ill, probably. I don't know
what you can't do it. It doesn't work if you're doing it because you're fearful of the government. It only works if you do it because in your heart, you don't want to speak ill. You have no ill will or feelings towards this person, this community, this group. And then you don't speak ill will towards them. If it's forced, that's why this equity thing is insanity. If it's forced top down from the government perspective to make you a good person, the opposite will happen, right? So it has to come from the heart. It has to come from the human. It's the humility the humor, right? I mean, soil, right, has to come from the earth. It has to come from our humility as persons, as incarnational persons, from our heart, from our gut, from our soul. And that's why, again, I'm an Orthodox Christian. It comes from asceticism and working through repentance and metanoia. And in doing so, that will have an effect. And you have to trust, because it doesn't look like it all the time. And it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done in your entire life. And that's okay.
Yeah. When you were talking about following Jesus in the way we treat people, I think if we can outcompete the establishment in the way we treat people nicer and kinder, more dignified, that will be the test that wins the day at the end of our time in history. And if we can be, defending victims consistently better than the victimists do, that again will be the test that'll be the thing that wins the day. They're always going to push their dumb drugs and products, but if our solutions to diseases are causing results like the elimination of serious chronic illnesses, people will take a look, because there's a certain survival level that will kick in to make people follow the right path when they want to live and they don't want to be sick, and like kind of a Noah's Ark effect there for solutions. And when we can solve pollution faster than the establishment, and with decentralized media distribution, get that information out to the people faster than they can stamp it out, we will win the day. We have to meet people where they are better than the gods of the city can. The gods of the city only have we take for granted, we keep assuming that like this inertia of this mutated victimism is a universal phenomenon that will be entrenched, but it's not. It's something that emanates from cultures that have been most haunted by the cross. And so the way to stop that is for people within those cultures to repent of their false imitation of Christianity and start imitating Jesus in an honest and good and true way. And when they do that, the cancer of victimism that the West is spreading to the globe by way of globalism and people imitating us for globalism's purposes will fix itself, will heal. And when you go to Japan right now, they don't have the same underlying social ordering logic that we do. But they have some, because because of our global hegemonic presence, we've affected them in a lesser degree, but in a way, right? And so what I'm saying is, when you live in another culture that functions without having all these deep presuppositions of victimism to make it function, you realize that it's not inevitable that this mutated heretical form of Christianity is the end all be all that we must all be haunted by tyrannically for the rest of history. It doesn't have to be that way. We can all choose to follow the more attractive option of incarnational, anthropologically grounded Christianity. And when we do that, the whole world will do it with us in different ways, because it's a much more attractive proposition. It's a much more attractive proposition to follow something that creates prosperity, something that creates wealth, abundance, and post-scarcity situations. Like, why do we have to rely? Like, look at that movie Oliver Stone put out. It's coming out soon, called Nuclear Now. Nuclear Now is Oliver Stone's picture of what the world could do to solve what he is concerned with climate change using nuclear energy. That's what I've been telling conservatives to do, or so-called anti-establishment people to do, but it's always our good buddies, the liberals, for various reasons, that are always catching the frequencies that I send out. I mean, so to speak. I'm being facetious here, but the point is, that's what conservatives should be doing. We should be advancing the conversation about nuclear energy. We should be advancing the conversation. They've done pretty okay with the seed oil thing. Okay. All right. That one is still something that a lot of conservatives are getting into. They still don't understand why they're supposed to be against seed oils, but they know it's catchy and trendy to say that you don't like seed oils. So that's a start. But we have to be the ones that give better solutions. And at the end of the day, the ones that actually produce results for human flourishing will be the ones that win the day on the world stage. So what I'm saying is, let's say it's 2050 America. And instead of it just being woke all the way, maybe a beautiful Christianity is starting to sprout up on a more equal footing with wokeism as the establishment religion. And so now the world is getting a taste of a more authentic Christianity exported to, or emanating around the world. That is something that folks are going to want to be a part of. They're going to want to be a part of something that is about abundance and post scarcity and opportunities for everybody that people are going to want to be a part of,
Yeah, I think that's happening. And I never would have come across someone like Father Turbo Qualls and a lot of great people that are living this Orthodox heart, this Orthodox life, right? So it's happening, right? We got to keep focusing on it, keep promulgating it, and keep fighting the fight with an open heart and with love for your neighbor as yourself. So I think that's it in a nutshell, man.
Very good. Thanks for joining me, James, and check out his podcast, The Rooster's Crow, James Kourtides on YouTube, and The Rooster's Crow podcast. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, David. God bless.